So I'm gonna tell you something because you're probably the only person who will understand. I used to hate the world, and I was happy when everyone died. But I was wrong, because there was one person worth saving.
You are listening to A Bite Of. I'm Noah, and we have a very special guest today. We have Brad from Comic Book Couples Counseling. Thank you so much for being here, Brad.
Oh, Noah, thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to be here, even though I just finished watching the latest episode of The Last of Us minutes ago, and I am holding back tears to have this conversation. I am devastated, and I'm still processing.
This is perfect then. It's going to be so fresh in your mind. I was up at like 2 a.m. watching it, so I mean, we'll just be wrecked together. We could do this.
I mean, I feel bad inside. Let's do this.
So we have Brad on here today because Derek is actually on a conference, and what an episode to have a guest on to come and talk, and then also to not have Derek on this.
Yeah.
Sorry, Brad. I mean, it had to be this one.
We didn't know it was going to be this episode when we planned this little collaboration.
No.
But as I was watching it, I was going, oh, of course it's this episode that I have to talk about.
One of the longest ones, one of the most heartbreaking ones. We got to get into it. So, as always, before we get into it, let's take a look back. So, last episode, in episode 2, Infected, we had Tess, Joel, and Ellie trying to get a car battery in exchange. They exchange Ellie to get a car battery from the Fireflies. We all know how that unfortunately ended with Tess getting the infected kiss of death, sadly leaving us way too soon. Thought it would be longer. It was not as long as it's just as much as the game. So that left just Joel and Ellie heading to Bill and Frank. And that's where we pick up on episode 3. So spoiler warning for episode 3. If you have not watched it, please go watch it and then come back and listen to this.
So I have never played the game. I'm very aware of the game, and I knew who the characters were. And when the show was cast, I was like, okay, I can imagine. I knew enough of the game to know that Tess wasn't going to be around for the whole season, right? So
Right.
I was prepared for Anna Torv to go away. But beyond that, I know nothing about this series. So when this episode wasn't really focusing for the most part on what I thought were the main characters, I was surprised very much so. Is that how the game operates? Do we have little side heartbreaks like this one?
The funny thing about the game is that it follows Joel and Ellie pretty strictly. And then you meet these people along the way. This is, so far, in the 3 episodes we've gotten, the biggest deviation from the game, which is exciting and also terrifying for what's to come. So now I have no idea what to expect. But yeah, so I mean, we meet Tess, she does end in the same way. So it's pretty quickly she goes away. But her presence is felt. Like the performance of that actor and everything really made you feel the absence of her.
I love Anna Torv. I was a huge fan of Fringe when it was on the air. And so I was stoked to know that she was going to be in this series, but also immediately heartbroken that she would disappear basically at some point. We knew
her fate.
And when we got that heartbreak last week, I mean, I felt it. You feel so much for Joel. Joel has gone through so much. Humanity has gone through so much in this series. But to lose Tess at the start of his relationship with Ellie, it felt like necessary. You understood why it exists for their eventual bond and relationship. But I was disappointed to see Anna Torv go because I think she's a phenomenal actor, and I would hope that this sort of rekindles some interest in her as a performer. I'd like to see Anna Torv get a show like Fringe or get a movie that supports the talent that she has.
I feel like this show has the opportunity to do what Game of Thrones did for all of those actors
Totally.
and just really push them more. So I 100% back more Torv in the future because
Yes.
she deserves it. 100%.
She's so good.
Yeah. So how did you feel about the show leading up to this point? So to kind of let our listeners know how you feel.
Okay. Well, like I said, I was not a fan of the game, I wasn't not a fan of the game. I knew nothing about the game. I don't play games. The last game I played was the first Red Dead Redemption, because I'm a mark for Westerns. But that's the last video game I played. I grew up playing games to the Sega Dreamcast to age myself. And when the Dreamcast came around, I kind of gave up because Sega was also kind of giving up the ghost as well.
That's true.
So I knew that the world was excited, especially like the nerd community around me was excited for The Last of Us, but I wasn't really necessarily looking to invest myself in another apocalyptic kind of story. I dismissed it as, The Walking Dead, or just another child of George Romero.
Right.
And the first episode, I still kind of felt that way. I think the second episode, once we got out of Boston a little bit and we started exploring beyond the more fascist elements of where our hellish society has gone, I engaged a little bit more with the relationships. I feel like the second episode, we really got to know those characters a lot more. And then this episode is just like all one big character piece. And that's my jam. That's what I'm here for. So yeah, my feeling was, do I need this thing in my life because it's going to be so oppressive in its emotional torture? But even though we just climaxed with the most emotionally torturous episode, I gotta keep going because I respect what the show has done so far, and it really does feel like it's firing on all cylinders. Everything in front of the camera and behind the camera is working really well for me. So I'll continue to break my heart week after week, I guess.
That's a good way to put it. Completely. I feel like the crew that they have behind the show is really showing through the show. I mean, you have Neil Druckmann, who is the creator for the show. And how often do you have somebody that's not just a producer credit on something like this, but so heavily involved? It's shining through the entire thing. I 100% week after week, just break my heart to keep watching this.
But like, do you find yourself in this new world that we're living in, where we have now gone through and are continuing to go through a pandemic? Do you find yourself gravitating towards stories like this one or recoiling from them? Because I'm in the latter camp. Like, I'm still in the place where it's like, no, I don't need to watch or rewatch Contagion. I love all the Dead films that Romero did, but they feel a little too close to home for me right now. And that's why I was resisting The Last of Us. Like, do you feel that tension? Or are you the type of person who's like, we're living through a pandemic, let's lean into it?
Oh, man. See, I want to say I'm middle of the road. I feel like depending on what it is. So like this, it has heavy pandemic vibes. Obviously, there's some type of virus and infection. So, but I feel like it's a step removed. So something like Contagion is way too close.
Yeah.
But I feel like the more fantastical elements to it makes it easier for me to separate it a little bit. But there are moments where I think even in this episode where they talk about how, the government failed during a pandemic and stuff like that. I was like, they might as well have just winked at the camera at that point. I was like, the whole conversation was just very...
I feel like they're breaking the fourth wall all the time in this show. And like, it's making my skin crawl. But they're doing it in a very not wink way, right? Like,
right.
There are moments where it's like, you feel the creator speaking directly to you, but it's not done in a, I don't know, like a pandering way.
Right. And I think that's the good distinction to make between it, because if it was very pandery, I think it wouldn't be accepted as much or as well done.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. Hot off of the death of Tess, this episode, I was curious if there was going to be a cold open like the other two. I love the cold opens. It's expanding the lore. And we didn't get that in the game. We got it bits and pieces more through in-game dialogue or finding notes. It was like hints on what happened, but we actually get more lore and they're expanding it through the cold opens. This entire episode was just one giant flashback. So they really leaned into that. But the beginning of it, I think, is really interesting. It might get overshadowed a little bit with the later half of the episode. But so we see Joel doing the Cairn of Rocks by the stream. And I thought that was actually a really neat thing that they showed, that it's not almost like it's like he feels guilty or like he's doing a tribute to her because he knows that he wasn't able to fully protect her like he was supposed to. I thought that moment was actually a really nice moment that they added, because they could have easily not done that.
Yeah, and Pedro Pascal just plays those scenes so well. He it's not like he doesn't have a lot of dialogue in this. He's got plenty of dialogue in the series, but the scenes where he has to communicate to the audience his internal life just through his facial expressions, which is something he doesn't get to do on The Mandalorian ever.
Yeah.
He has to do all of that in body language and double language, I guess. But here, I mean, he really does get to do the cowboy thing, the Western movie thing, where you're just lost in the tiny micro movements of his face. So like that scene, it's just a tour de force of acting.
Yeah. And he's just stacking some rocks.
Yeah, it's awesome.
It's so good. This episode does a good job of furthering the relationship between Ellie and Joel just a little bit, but you can still tell that they don't fully trust each other. In this scene where, she learns a little bit more about what happened with people that didn't actually get to QZs, or where they're stashing stuff, going to a home for the first time, seeing a gas station for the first time, doing all that type of stuff. But you can see that she almost needs that, like something to admire, or what is it, like a protective figure almost. She's very watchful of him. And I think that was neat that they keep doing subtle moments like that. But the conversation that they had before they start their 5-hour hike to Bill and Frank's, that she flat out says, this was not my fault. Like, Tess wasn't my fault. We can still do this, but I just need you to know, like, I didn't ask you to do this and nobody made you do this. And I think he respected that.
Yeah. And we've all been in situations like that where something horrible happens to you, and who do you take it out on? You take it out on the people that are around you, whether they had something to do with it or not. And I loved her just calling him out on that. Said, you have culpability in this. Like, if you're going to take some kind of anger or revenge or self-loathing out on me, you should just recognize that you had a part to play in it. And I thought it was just like a ballsy thing to say. And again, really well acted.
This scene in the basement of that gas station,
very good.
That was terrifying, but really interesting. Like, I want to see how far they'll go with how she's processing everything, because she's a post-apocalyptic child. So what does that actually do to a kid?
Yeah, and there's been moments before this episode, I believe in the second episode, where Anna Torv where Tess was saying, oh, those kids were, post-outbreak day. And you start to think about, trying to explain 9/11 to people who weren't around when 9/11 happened. There's like pre 9/11 and post 9/11.
Right.
And I like how this show is ramming home, what's the word I'm looking for? But this idea of loss just in how people develop having never knew what they had lost, right? So like the kids post-outbreak day are are just not going to fully understand or appreciate the horror that they're living in, because the horror that they're living in is just life. It's always been this way. But for people like Tess and Joel, I mean, every day is you're waking up to atrocity.
It's a reminder of what you had prior. That's actually that might be worse. I mean,
oh, it's way worse.
How it was prior, and then you're living with what happened, and then Ellie is just in this world. This is how it is. Yeah, it kind of sucks, but like, I mean, they're not telling me anything, so this is how I'm gonna be. I haven't been talking too much about the future of the game, or even the second part, because I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, and I won't spoil anything for you. But there is a theme of Ellie through the games with her rage or her violence, and so I think we are getting these two interesting themes with her, where she's post-apocalyptic child dealing with how that is, and then who she is in her mental state, or who she is as a person, and almost seeing when she cut open the top of that infected's head. She was curious probably on what, if it felt it or not, but it was a little sociopathic.
That's okay. I'm glad you went there, because that's, again, I have no understanding of the game, but that was kind of my read. I started to think like, oh, I know she's like a chosen child, because of whatever strange cocktail is going on in her genetics, but that was very Dahmer-esque.
Yeah. Just a little bit.
Yeah. So I'm now concerned for Ellie and anyone around Ellie.
Yeah. And then she goes back upstairs and she's cracking jokes. I'm like, where's the nearest person that can talk to her about what's going on? Because I think she needs to talk it out a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Finding out. So before we talk about Bill and Frank, there's one thing I think is appropriate to kind of lead into that. Finding out what happened to the people if the QZs were full. I don't believe they actually did that in the game, but I think that was such a harrowing element to add to this, and something that I don't want to say I could see happening, but it's like, oh shit, that could happen. I guess like
I could totally see it happening.
Yeah.
And I feel like it has happened in human history many times, too many times.
Right.
And it felt very honest to me. And again, it's that honesty that I kind of recoil against, because I don't know if I want to party in this world every Sunday night.
Yeah.
But I appreciated that sequence and how it led to the flashback, from a execution point of view. Pardon that awful pun. I don't mean to say execution.
Oh
there.
No.
But when we zoom in on that flap of fabric and then we pull out and we see the woman's dress, the mother's dress, and we immediately now connect the two scenes. We know her future. We know probably what that baby's future is. And it's just such a down place to begin this chapter. We were already in the muck and now we're below the muck. It's such a brutal place to begin a flashback.
It's probably going to go down in history as one of the most depressing transitions between present and past.
Yeah, and then, I mean, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but when we start to see Bill take advantage of his situation, as a survivalist, he's been waiting, he's been prepping for this moment. All his fears have been realized. Who's the dumb one now? Not Bill. So when we start to have kind of like fun with him building his community, and even when you're having fun watching him take advantage of this moment and really put his skills to use, that this fun little needle drop and musical moment is not going to last at all. So even in like the high moments of this series, you just know that there's a decline right over the hill.
Yeah, that's unfortunate with the territory we're in with this. We can't be happy or take a breath for too long.
No, I'm not allowed to be happy watching The Last of Us, and I don't know how I feel about that, but that's just how it is.
But Bill's bunker, Nick Offerman's bunker, because I feel like Nick Offerman could possibly craft something like this because he is very crafty himself. It very much seems like this dude obviously had been prepping for this.
Oh, yeah.
But had already removed himself from society. So when you do get that montage of just his like supermarket sweep through the entire town, getting everything, it's like, oh, he's in his complete element. This is what he's wanted.
Yeah, it's like those scenes in Dawn of the Dead, the original Dawn of the Dead, where they finally have the mall all to themselves and it's party time. Like, we've all kind of fantasized about that. Like, okay, if there was an apocalypse, where would we go?
Right.
And you kind of go like, boy, it sure would be great to just completely take over that sporting goods, you know?
Yeah.
And so there is a delight to be had at this point in The Last of Us. But again, that delight does not last.
I feel like I'd be very ill prepared because this dude not only thought of getting a natural gas, whatever the supply, bringing it to there, getting all the gas out of the gas pumps. Like, he went straight for the things that he knew would get turned off.
Yeah.
I would have thought about that afterwards. I'm like, I need to get all the food, everything I need, and then
I'm one of the first to go. I know that. I'm not prepped. I am not Bill. I need to find my Bill. And Lisa, my beloved wife, is also not Bill. So, oof.
Yeah, I think, oh man, I think most of us are Franks.
Yeah.
In this situation, we all do need to find our Bill that can really get us there.
Yeah, and just hope the person who traps us in their hole gives us a ladder.
Yeah. When Frank, the game, okay, I can talk about this part in the game because
so
I
these
feel
are characters from the game.
100%.
Okay.
The biggest difference is we never see Frank alive in the game.
Oh, sad.
Yeah. So we don't get any really interaction with Frank at all. So when we meet Bill, it's the same situation. He has to go to Bill to get a car battery. He knows that Bill's going to have this. When they meet him, Bill is at the beginning of the Bill that we know from this. He's very much a survivalist. He's cut off. He wants nothing to do with anybody. The progression of that episode in the game, we learn through nuance, kind of in-game storytelling, that Frank and Bill were partners.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing really else is said from that. They find Frank, he had hung himself. He left Bill. He couldn't deal with his doomsday prepping and all of that stuff. He ended up killing himself, and then all the characters in the game find his body. And then he reveals to Joel that it was his partner. There was a suicide note. But again, this was all very nuanced. This game came out over a decade ago, so a little bit of a different time. I'm glad that they went full on into it in this one, because I don't need nuanced LGBTQ representation in 2023.
So when we get to Frank in the hole, what are you feeling? Like, because it becomes pretty clear, like, oh, we're going to hang out with these two for a while for this episode.
Yeah, I think by, how long is this episode? Like 80 minutes long? I think by like minute 45, I realized that, oh, this entire episode is Bill and Frank's show. I was so happy because you don't get something like this. It's a game or whatever that you like, and you never got those stories, and you're finally getting it told in a beautiful and more explained way. I was very happy. I think getting to know these characters and seeing them change a little bit from, I want to say, their base level character arcs is always a great thing to see.
I'm hoping that the response to this episode being as strong as it's been will allow for more stories like this one in an apocalyptic setting. Like, so often a post-apocalyptic story is like a quest, or, you know, we got to survive. We got to, you know, humanity's awful. They're the real problem. So let's defend ourselves from the slavers and the raiders and all that stuff. I would kill to have a movie that is just about characters like Bill and Frank meeting each other and falling in love as the world around them has collapsed. Like, can I have the romantic comedy post-apocalyptic story, that's what I want. And I wanted this episode to be the whole series.
Yeah. It did. It felt so on its own in a beautiful way. And the way they connected at the end, I felt was also did a lot of heavy lifting, but put a lot of the emotional baggage on the transition between that.
Yeah.
But it really did. It felt like you were just watching this show because they introduced these two characters that you don't need to care about, have never been introduced in the show before, and you fell in love with them. And you were just watching their life together, 20 years of them just being together. I 100% agree. I think, why not? We don't need all this stuff to be action, action, action. Just give me a nice, romance drama of them just trying to survive but live together.
Well, again, I mean, I'm gonna jump to the end of their story a little bit, but this idea of Bill being someone who, in his doomsday prepping, grew to hate humanity and fear humanity and prepare for humanity's end because humanity obviously deserves to die. And in prepping, he saves one person, Frank, and discovers that was his life. Like, that was the purpose, was to protect this one human being. And that gave him a sense of, I don't know if like the word hope is right, but
purpose, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely gave him purpose. Like, he recognized that it was his purpose. And in having that purpose, he got relief, right?
Yeah.
From whatever depression he was in beforehand. And I love that idea. And it's something that I've had a lot of practice doing in the last couple of years, falling into despair about our little globe, and then digging myself out of that despair thanks to the relationships that I have, and the connection that we have with our small communities is enough to sustain us from all the bigger worries that exist beyond it. I just found that ending really relatable, but also a moment of being seen. Like, it felt like a little bit of one of those fourth wall breaks where the creators obviously know what we're all going through. We're all experiencing a little bit of where Bill was at the beginning of this episode. And it was, I don't know, it was like a little hug. It was super sad and awful.
Right.
But it was like an I see you audience member. Here's a little hug.
Yeah. It was very, I know that there's like this sector of people that could use this type of thing. Because, I mean, you see things like, what was it? Don't Look Up and all that stuff. And it is still very doomsday, and it's a little too much on the negative side of that.
Well, cynical, right?
Right.
And it's easy to be like cynical.
Very
it's super hard not to be cynical. And I feel like not being cynical is a practice and requires a lot of flexing of different types of muscles. And I felt like that's what this episode was helping me do.
The performances between these two, Murray and Nick.
Nick Offerman and Murray Bartlett.
Yes, Bartlett. That's his last name. I always forget his last name. Nick Offerman did, I think, I don't want to say more heavy lifting, but his character required him to show different layers. When he finally lets Frank in the house and showers and all of that, and they have a lovely first meal together, which I would kill to have in a post-apocalyptic setting.
Ditto.
Wine too?
Yeah.
But seeing him portray this character as somebody that gave up on society, probably has not had an affection or touch in any type of way. You get the sense that his mom was around at some point, but is no longer around. Other than that, he hadn't been able to really express his desire for anybody, let alone for men. I mean, he had a "Don't Tread on Me" flag down in his bunker. You can probably tell he wasn't at any pride rallies or anything like that.
Yes.
So he's really suppressing a lot of that stuff. And then to have this ray of light come into his life in the form of a man dropping into his pit trap. But like, it was so interesting to see, but also really carefully done. That first kiss, whenever they're on the piano, taking turns playing the piano as well, hearing Nick Offerman sing, amazing. But it was so nice. It was just nice to see that it was to give them love and companionship, even though, Bill didn't know it at the time.
Yeah. I feel like I had been too trained by The Walking Dead to not trust a character like Nick Offerman.
Right.
When you're introduced to Bill in before his wall of monitors down in the basement, clutching his shotgun with his "Don't Tread on Me" flag on the wall, you're like, oh, okay, Governor, what's up? I know where this is going. And then just like, what a little miracle of an episode for it not to go that way, to actually swing in the absolute opposite direction and be just this love story, this beautiful love story.
Yeah, and that's such a good way to put it. We got this unexpected love story in the most unexpected of situations. And it's the story's bleak. It's I think it's completely fair to say that, but that's kind of what the show is about. And whenever people, I feel like, oh, it's just going to be The Walking Dead, I can't wait for them to experience it, even if it's baseline what the story of the game was, which it seems to be, because it's not, the infected just happen to be there. The world just happens to be what it is. These people are in that situation, but it's really about those relationships. It's almost like, if you don't have love in your life, you're just surviving. It's just those relationships. I love that they're really going all in on that.
And, I don't want to dog on The Walking Dead too much, or shows like Game of Thrones too much, shows that I've all enjoyed at various points.
Love them.
During their runtime. But sometimes I feel like I don't trust HBO to give me a story like this. Right.
Right.
And when you do get a story like this one, it's like, oh, they snuck something really beautiful in here. That's not just a sensationalistic horror show. And and then what you have with this episode is it's really just an episode about two people, and how their relationship will obviously then go on to inform and inspire Joel and Ellie's relationship. And I mean, I was like, is this HBO? I was surprised. I just wasn't expecting it.
It's the Last of Us network. That's what.
Yeah.
That's what it is at that point. I liked how they showed their relationships and, interesting year increments. It's almost like just really beautiful vignettes throughout time and showing their relationship, but showing all the ups and downs from Frank being completely stir crazy in the house and just wanting to unnecessarily almost redo some of the town for the imaginary friends that they might have at one point, which they do get.
Yeah.
And then Bill being the resource manager, being like, no, we can't even spare paint. Lawnmower? No. But it was interesting to see that type of thing. And you saw the very loving and tender moments, but also the not so loving and tender moments. The raid that happened, which was the only really action piece in this episode.
Yeah, and also didn't go the way I thought it was going to go.
Same.
So, every time this show looks like it's going to swing left, it goes right. And when you think it's going to go right, it goes left. And I hope we can keep that up, which, again, sometimes you don't feel that in adaptation. Whether you're familiar with the work or not, you feel like the story is on tracks and it's just moving to a destination, or it's wildly off the tracks. And the sense that I get is that this show is using the framework of the game, but modifying the path to whatever the destination is.
Yeah, it's really interesting when they especially have an adaptation of a game, because if you think about what you do in a game most of the time, it's collecting something, killing stuff, going from literally checkpoint to checkpoint. And so when you do that in a show format or movie format, how do you interpret those things that you would casually be doing in a game on the screen? I have yet to see Joel really pick up things like he does in the game. I'm waiting for that scene where he goes through draws and he's just picking up a bunch of stuff.
Well,
but
in the beginning of this episode, he does go to find like his stash.
That is true.
And that felt like a little bit like a game.
He did put stuff and then he put it back.
Yeah.
It's 100%. But I think it is. I think they're adapting it how you should adapt a game or something like this, because it's expanding on some of the little things that you get. A lot of times we don't get those lore expansions that we'd like to see. I mean, Resident Evil is kind of a good example of some of the missteps that you could do.
Don't take me down a Resident Evil path, because I'm going to tell you right now, I love the movies. Like, I love every single one of those trashy, terrible films, and I will defend them. But we'll need like a whole podcast series where we rewatch all of them for me to do that. But I understand what you're saying. And it does feel like, you know, I'm like really quickly just going through the video game adaptations that I've experienced. This has to be like at the top, right? If it's probably the best game adaptation I've experienced, and I'm only 3 episodes in.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I mean, Uncharted, not for me.
No thanks.
You know, so I think there's very few. I think a handful, maybe less than 4 that are worthy of like the adaptation that they got.
I would love people to tweet at me what the best video game adaptations are, and if they are better or worse than The Last of Us. At Mouthdork, everyone on Twitter.
There you go. I if somebody does that, I can't wait to see what they put, because I would very much like to know.
Yeah, my opinion on video game movies is very low.
There's no shame in liking the Resident Evil movies. I love the Resident Evil movies.
I mean, you don't even understand like how much I love those movies, but we can't get into it.
Finding out the reason why the 80s music was playing at the end of the first episode.
So good.
So good. It was almost subtle if you didn't, I guess, really pick up on the like who was sending it in the first place. But
is that in the game? Is that code in the game?
No.
Oh, such a good code.
It is really good. I mean, do it by decades of music.
Probably expensive, though. Like if you were going to buy the rights to all these different songs, probably expensive.
To see which ones are in public domain.
Yeah,
I'm sure there might be a few, but will you know them and what decade they're in?
Most certainly not.
But finding that out, I thought that was a good little nod, a callback to the first episode. The choice for Frank to eventually, through their entire life, and we see them finally get to their older state. At first, when I saw them in their elderly makeup, almost, I was like, it's only been 20 years. Why do you guys look so old? I'm like, oh, you guys were probably 40 or 50 when you guys met.
Yeah,
that makes.
You know, you look back at the people who lived through real lives. Like, you know, if you go look at photos of my grandparents in like the 40s, like they aged. And I feel like right now we're pretty cushy human beings, and we're not aging the way that previous generations would. But if we had an experience like these people did, we would age.
Just day to day would age you a little more.
Rapid. It would be rapid.
Having to trade guns to get strawberry seeds.
That's some gray.
Too stressful.
Yeah. A lot of gray in the hair doing that.
Just immediately. But his choice to end things, and that he knew that his illness was overcoming him too much, and his quality of life just wasn't where he would want it to be. He's lived a fulfilled life, which I thought was actually pretty beautiful for them to do. I was nervous going into this episode because we always have that thing that happens with LGBTQ characters in media where they're not really treated right. They usually die. It's usually not their choice. All of that stuff.
Fridged, right? Like, I mean,
fridged.
It does feel like these characters are fridged to benefit Ellie and Joel's story. And I am still kind of struggling with that. Again, I've just finished watching this episode, But when we got
You're
to
still
this
processing.
ending, I mean, I honestly don't know how I feel about it.
I think the only comfort that I take in it would be, one, we got a beautiful like vignette of their life. So it was like, cool, we got to see them be happy. But they chose to do that. And I think giving them that agency and that choice to do that is a little bit more of a step of an outside force or using it as shock value to kill them. Yeah, they did write them to die, but I think there's a little bit of like poetry in the way that they sent themselves off.
Yeah, but also like this is where I'm going to have the most I'm not going to say like negative feelings, but I really am struggling to figure out how I feel about it. One, like suicide in art is a weird thing to me. I often feel like suicide is not used in a moral way. Like I don't know how you feel. I don't know how I feel about suicide being used as a plot device in stories. I'm reading The Last Ronin right now, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series, or rereading it. And of course, Western writers are fetishize seppuku and the Japanese idea of honor, or at least how we interpret the Japanese idea of honor, having watched a bunch of Akira Kurosawa movies, right? And like, I'm really having difficulty with the way Michelangelo in that series in the first issue approaches the moment of seppuku. And then where that story ultimately takes that character, which I will not spoil The Last Ronin on this podcast, but I don't like it. And so when we get to this sequence in The Last of Us, where Frank has asked Bill to help him end on his terms, which I totally respect a human being for wanting to do that. And then Bill, we can spoil this, right? We get like,
oh yeah, 100%.
And then Bill joining him because this has been his purpose. And my wife and I have this conversation weirdly frequently because we're always reading stories about the apocalypse and what we would do when the zombies rise. And
normal
Lisa's
conversation.
like, I'm out of here. And it bugs me. She's joking. Maybe like we have to wait until that situation arises for me to truly understand if she is joking or not. I really
one
don't
way
know.
To find out.
But we talk about our mortality and what it would be like for one of us to no longer be around, and what would we do? We've been married now for 14 years. I can't imagine life without her. But I don't like the idea of going like, well, you were my purpose and now I'm gone. But Lisa's like, no, you were my purpose and you're gone. I'm gone. Like she says she would do the Bill thing if Frank went that way. And I don't know if I would.
Interesting.
And just this story, putting this conversation out there, makes me really uncomfortable. Me right now talking to you about it makes me really uncomfortable because I don't want to say the wrong thing. But, suicide, especially in the young, it can be an infectious thing, right? And it is a real plague out there in high schools and beyond. And anytime a story, especially a popular story, presents suicide, I'm wishing like
in an accessible way,
in an accessible way, and like in a poetic way, to use your word, in a poetic way, it makes me feel squidgy. And so I feel very squidgy about the ending. And I do feel like when we get to the end and we have Ellie and Joel reading Bill's letter and Bill saying, this was my purpose. Now I want you to take everything that I've built here and keep Tess safe. And like, I just start crying.
Yeah.
And it's so effective. But then you go, hold up. did we just fridge these dudes for their story? And that makes me a little pissed.
I think, that I don't think I thought about it in the plot device way or furthering the story. I think I did, but I didn't think of it as like a writer literally sitting there being like, okay, how do we get these characters to go here?
And it doesn't play that way. It doesn't necessarily play that way, but that's where my brain went.
Right.
As I was bawling.
Just trying to process the whole thing. I mean, when that letter, which is it's such a better letter than Frank left Bill in the game, but Bill's suicide note, I guess that's what it was, really, telling Joel, him knowing that Joel was going to be the one that found it, and then Ellie seeing a little bit more into Joel's life or his relationships with people. But that test line, like, I mean, him going outside and not knowing like how, I thought he was going to go punch something. I thought he was just going to like scream. He didn't do any of that. And he's still repressing everything almost. And again, Pedro Pascal doing loads of work with doing nothing really.
It's so good. Yeah.
It's so good. But it was a reminder again to him that he failed. He failed tests, and he really needs to step it up for Ellie.
Yeah. I mean, he's lost everything many times over, and he doesn't want to open himself up to Ellie in any way. This is not the type of pain he would like to invite into his life once again. But that's what it means to be alive.
Yeah. Yeah. The line, I think, that was in, what was it, the beginning of the note? It said, I used to hate the world and I was happy when everyone died, but I was wrong. I mean, I want to think, I think where my brain went with, I guess, realizing Bill decided to go with Frank. It's the whole Romeo and Juliet thing. We've seen it before. I think where my brain went, because now you're making me think of like actually thinking about it in a broader sense, was, I mean, how old were they? One. But I mean, I guess what would, in that type of world where there's no doctors, there's no comfortable way to really go.
Yeah. I cannot judge the characters. I will not judge the characters, but I will judge the writers for putting that scene out there. Right. Like, but again, this is the thing about me feeling so complicated about it, because that line about I hated the world and I was glad when everyone was dead, but I was wrong. Oh, like that's the hug. Like that's the line that I needed, because I so understand that in 2023 right now. Yeah. And I was wrong. That I was wrong is in the relationships that I have with the people in my life. And it just reiterates like how important it is to remain connected to people, not the planet, but to individuals.
It goes back to the point of, I mean, if you don't really share your life with someone, or you're not involved with in a community or any sorts, you're kind of just living to survive. And it's not really, I mean, how much fun is that going to be? I mean, he's sitting there eating dinner alone, watching infected just die like casually. So, I mean, how long can you really do something like that until it's fulfilling?
It depends on the people. I also don't want to dismiss the solitary on this planet. I used to consider myself infinitely single until I met Lisa. And you could have a perfectly cool existence living that way. But I also think that even if you are infinitely single, it helps to make connections with others around you, or find like that core group, find that family,
That's almost the Frank side of things, where he needed to reach out and he was just pinging people who wants to talk to me. I need to make friends.
Yeah. Like I feel so weird about the ending, and what you're listening to right now is me just fumbling my way through my feelings. So I hope anyone listening will give me some leeway on where I am searching, because I haven't landed anywhere on how I ultimately feel that ending works or does not work, if I find it offensive or not offensive.
Do you think if you landed on one way or another, would it make or break how you feel about this episode?
No, because the first, like, let's say I come out of this conversation or days from now and I go, you know what, that was a fridging, forget that, I hate it. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it doesn't negate the episode as a whole and the beauty that we did get and how unique this episode is. So wherever I ultimately land, I'm going to come out saying that this is one of the best hours of television I've experienced.
Man,
And that's wild.
it's so intimate and so just plays out that I think the reception it's getting is actually surprising. I had heard prior to the show premiering, all the people that got screeners and have seen the first, 6 or whatever episodes.
Those jerks.
They all talked about this episode. They all said that this is the episode, and episode 7 apparently, but this is the episode. And when I saw it, I was surprised. Only that I guess that's the cynical part of me, that I didn't think that a zombie apocalypse show just telling a love story for 80 minutes was really going to capture people like it did.
Yeah, yeah. And now that I've been given this, can I have a whole series about Frank and Bill? That's the next stage. Like, give me that version of The Last of Us. Give me Frank and Bill's story, or somebody, or like a relationship like Frank and Bill's in the apocalypse. I'm ready.
The years in between.
Yeah, give me the whole thing.
Hey, that would actually bring Anna Torv back, because they hung out.
Yeah, yeah. I'm for it.
I loved that interaction when they first meet them. You see Bill in a button up, tucked in, still has the gun, and he's just very much like, I'm not here for this. Joel being the counterpart to that. And then just having Tess and Frank loving every second of it was so good.
Yeah, and Nick Offerman and Pedro Pascal across from each other. I mean, yeah, it was like a delight to see them two performing as their significant others are in the house just having a great time, and these two dudes just can't trust each other.
Not one bit.
No.
Let them handle it. The other two will be fine.
I've been in situations like that too. You know, you're doing a double date, or you're going into a party situation, and your partner goes off and pairs with somebody else, and they're having a blast, and you're stuck with that person. You're like, I don't know. What am I going to do with this other human being here? We have nothing in common. But then you have everything in common. They're basically reflections of each other.
100%. And then it's like, what do you talk about?
Yeah.
Where Ellie and Joel are going from here. I'm very excited to see what kind of episode they're going to follow this up with, because it was slow, and I put that in quotes, but I feel like they might go full on into tension, action, just from seeing that snippet of what's coming up. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a whiplash to go from that to this, but
I'm extremely curious. One of the benefits of this episode is it doesn't necessarily move the plot. And again, that's just such a gem to have a story that's not really all about plot. And it also opens up the idea that this show can give us different kinds of stories than just the reluctant daddy story that I thought The Last of Us was. And my question to you, because I get done with this episode, I'm a weepy mess. It's time to podcast. Now we're talking about it. But as the credits were going, I was asking myself, like, this is good. I feel that bittersweetness that an episode like this provides. But I also still have the question of like, is this a good time? Like, and not that like every episode needs to be a good time, but is this a show that I should be watching week to week and, recapping it like you? Or is it a show that I should wait until it's all wrapped up and then binge it? Because I feel like if every episode is going to put me through the emotional ringer like this one, I need to get it done. Like, I don't want to gnarl at the scab. I want to whip a Band-Aid off.
I mean, I think that would depend, right? So if you do want to get it over and done with, I think that, it might be good to binge it. But I was curious about how it would feel in the week to week format. But our conversation here, and especially talking to somebody with different eyes than my partner, because we watch it together, so we're kind of processing it together. The kind of hearing how you're processing it is actually really interesting. I feel like you probably wouldn't sit here long enough with that type of emotion if you were just to hit the next episode.
That is true. That is 100%. This is the most raw review I've ever done. This conversation, and it's so vulnerable to be in that position.
We might as well just had live commentary while you were
yes. Now, so my other question is, and I don't want to spoil The Last of Us, but because of pop culture being what it is, and because The Last of Us is just so ever present out there in that conversation, I'm aware that in the second game, it's like a misery fest. Like it takes the first sad story and just really says like, oh, you thought that was sad. I'm going to show you sad. And I don't know if I can handle it.
This show just got renewed for season 2.
Right.
What I'm hoping for, and this is a big hope because there is a time jump between the games. I'm hoping that we get more time, that they tell that story before the lead up to the second one, because the second one, I'm telling you, I obviously will not spoil it because I will not do that to people. But I got to a certain part in the game and I stopped playing it for a good almost month.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
I just couldn't emotionally really be like, I don't know why you did this to me. This is not fun. So I'm interested to see if they'll change it. I mean, they deviated so much with Bill and Frank's story that I feel like they could potentially deviate with some of that stuff, but I don't know. Man, if they do that, it's not going to be
how much do you hold the game's content as canon? Like, the show has to go the same places ultimately that the game went. Like, what if the show just creates an entirely different track and goes somewhere completely different? Would you be upset by that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think I don't like to be like a very strict like source material. This is canon. Why would they change that? I love when they tell a new story with something that, it's like The Walking Dead almost, or any comic that's been interpreted into a movie or a show or anything like that. It's kind of fun to see how they adapt it, and it makes it fresh for somebody that has already experienced it. I don't think I would be upset. I think with what they've done so far, I would trust them, and I put an asterisk saying, let's see how the rest of this goes.
So if they created like a really happy ending for me, it'd be okay.
Yes. I mean, I don't want to go through what the end of that second one, which I feel like they could possibly. So
yeah. Okay.
I'd be very happy for a second ending. But you mentioned something that like, does it ultimately have to go to the same place? I think if it ultimately hits the themes and character development with some of the things, it would be just as effective. I don't think the same events necessarily have to play out, but as long as they kind of get that same feel of the growth of this or what the point of this is, I'd be pretty happy.
And it seems like folks are already appreciating the deviations that the show is doing from the game.
Yeah. I mean, the part in the game with Bill is relatively short, but I think a lot of people are almost upset the lead to Bill and Frank's, because you get this level in the school and you get this big bloater infected, which I think we have seen in the trailer. So we're going to eventually get that type of thing. But I mean, I think it's been received well, because that's almost how they had to tell this story without it just being like avoiding booby traps the entire time.
Yeah. And we didn't even really talk about the design in this show, but it's astonishing and worth watching just for that.
It's the final shot.
Oh my God. Yes. I'm so glad you brought up the final shot.
Yeah. I almost completely forgot about it, but you mentioned design and I was like, have to mention that final shot. Glad that they didn't go into the room, because second he was trying to open it, I was like, I don't want to watch this. But going into the room where they're going to be for the rest of forever, and seeing Joel and Ellie leave with what they had left them, there's no scene that was so simple but so effective that I could think of.
Chef's kiss. A tired, overused metaphor, but chef's kiss.
Hey, when it works, it completely works.
Yeah.
It completely works. I think it is safe to say that we enjoyed this episode.
Yes.
The ending for you is still cooking.
Yes.
Still cooking.
Yeah.
But I feel like it will be in a lot of people's minds.
Oh, for sure.
A while.
And I would love to hear from people how they feel about that. Specifically what we were talking about in terms of their relationship informing Joel and Ellie's relationship. And if we're all cool with that. Because that's what I'm really working out.
So whenever we have something that we want, listeners to kind of just tell us or whatever, we usually just tell them to comment below. But we don't usually tell them where to do that. That's for their discretion. So they could do it on Discord or anything like that.
Got it.
Like that. So
if you want me to see it, at MouthDork on Twitter or at CBCC Podcast, help me out. Like, I need help.
And if they send it to us, we'll just put it out there and be like, this is for you.
Yeah, forward it to me.
Yeah, CC. Yeah. Oh, man. Thank you so much for coming on here and talking about this episode. I got a text from Derek. He had finally watched it today, and he said, this had to be the episode that I was not here for. Of course it is. So,
and do you think he's happy about that or sad about that?
I think it plays to his benefit, because he could probably think about it longer than both of us have before he has to come back here and maybe say something about it. So I think it plays to his benefit. But, I mean, I couldn't ask for a better person to talk about this with. Your reviews are always fantastic, so I had to pick your brain.
Oh, well, thank you. This was a lot of fun and therapeutic, like legitimately therapeutic. And you've saved Lisa some serious time.
I'm glad to hear it. How about you tell people what you guys got going on? You guys just did a screening of Howard the Duck.
We did.
And you're not that far from us, but I was like, oh, man.
It would have been worth it. It would have been worth it. It was a great screening. We hosted Howard the Duck, the first Marvel movie, if you don't count the 1940 whatever serials of Captain America, at the Alamo Drafthouse in Winchester, Virginia, the greatest movie theater on the planet. And it is kickstarting a new comic book film series that Comic Book Couples Counseling is hosting. Our next one is going to be on March 12th, and we are doing Lone Wolf and Cub, Sword of Vengeance, the first in that series, based on the epic and brilliant manga that Dark Horse Comics has just started republishing the omnibuses for. Well worth seeking that out. And we are scheduling some other really crazy comic book movies, the goal being to highlight what the medium can do. It's not all superhero stuff. It's not all high art, obviously. We started with Howard the Duck. But it's all not low art either. And it's been a lot of fun. So yeah, you can find all information on that by going to comicbookcouplescounseling.com, which is where Lisa and I have our podcast. We take a famous comic book couple or a not so famous comic book couple, and we pair it with a self-help guide. We are actually discussing sibling love right now using the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Dr. Huebner's work. And we are wrapping that up with The Last Ronin. And then we are going to move on to Eve and Mark from Invincible. And we're going to do a 4-episode series. We're struggling with what arcs in Invincible to cover. It's such a huge series.
Oh my God.
So we invited Robert Kirkman on the show. He agreed. And he programmed the episodes for us. So that episode will be dropping in a couple weeks. Be on the lookout for it.
That one, I cannot wait to hear that one. That's insane.
Yeah,
and
very excited.
It's just, I know that the second season of Invincible is coming out this year, but what a great time to really pick the brain of the creator before we get the second season of that show. I mean,
yeah, it was a very short conversation. They only gave us like 15 minutes. And that's why we're like, Robert Kirkman's going to program our podcast series. Let's do this. But we do get into some of his philosophy about comic book romances and actually romances in real life. And we talk about his marriage. So tune in.
A deep look.
A deep look, yes.
Kirkman.
In 15
you
minutes.
guys can find I'll put the links to your guys' stuff down below in the show notes or the description. But thank you so much for being on here. Maybe we'll have to see if you could come back for the finale and see where you're
I'm into it. Let's see if I make it. If I make it, I will be here if you invite me. Thank you. This was like such a pleasure. And again, therapeutic.
Thanks for listening to A Bite of. Artwork and editing by our own Noah. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at A Bite of Pod and on Facebook at A Bite of. If you have any questions, recommendations, or just want to say hi, you can contact us on abiteofpod.com. Please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review to spread the word. See you next time on A Bite of. Bye!